So now let me turn to introducing today's speakers, who will be unpacking the lessons of the war in Ukraine as of today. And these lessons are continuing to unfold in real time. So we're going to continue to learn and study this conflict. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to be presenting. The first is Barry Posen. He's the Ford International Professor of Political Science and former director of the MIT Security Studies program. He's the author of many books, most recently Restraint, A New Foundation for U.S. Grand Strategy. Next will be Carol Saivetz. She's a senior advisor at the Security Studies program. She's an expert on all things related to Soviet and Russian foreign policy and a frequent commentator, including in Washington on our local television stations about what's happening in Russia and the war in Ukraine. Our third speaker will be Mariya Grinberg. She's an assistant professor of political science. She's the newest addition to the faculty at the Security Studies program. We're really delighted to have her. Her work focuses on why states trade with their enemies, and the sort of relationship between economics and statecraft and security more generally. So welcome to all of you. And Barry, I turn the microphone over to you.
Okay, I'll leave it to you to keep time here. I'm going to try and be brief. Taylor asked me to talk about some of the military aspects of the war. And the problem with talking about the military aspects of the war is the newspapers are full of somebody's favorite lesson of the war or someone's favorite development of the war. And there's a pretty standard story out there, and I don't want to tilt with every aspect of the standard story, in part because it might be right. I'm not really sure. But I am going to offer, say, three working hypotheses about possible lessons that might be of some interest, right? And one of them is about weapons, one of them is about tactics, and one of them is about people. So the first is about Russian weapons. And one of the things that I've been interested in first the Soviet military and now the Russian military for a long time. And it's hard not to talk about what is really a horrible war in a kind of a clinical hobbyist sort of way. It's something that happens with people who study conventional war. So, if I become flippant, it's just something that happens. It's not that I don't understand what's going on here. So I've been looking at the Sovs for a long time, and now the Russians, and I what I see is what I saw. Right? It was a long time ago. Over 30 years ago, I worked briefly as a council fellow in the Pentagon, doing NATO-Warsaw Pact force comparisons, learning about new Russian tanks and formations and all the rest of it. A lot of the stuff I consumed then has now been declassified. You can find it at the CIA website now. And I often find myself looking at the present conflict through those lenses, right? Because it looks the same to me. Now, it could be I'm just an old guy with old lenses, and this is the lens I have, right? But some things look familiar. So first about weapons and about tactics and about people. Weapons. So Russian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles have been notorious for their flaws since 1967, right? We're in the third or fourth generation of crappy Russian armored vehicles, right? And this is kind of a weird thing, because people have been blowing these armored vehicles to pieces all over the world. Russian designers have had lots of time to work on this problem. We've gone through a couple of generations of Russian tanks. So far, appears not to be much change, or to the extent that there is change, the Western designers who design anti-armor warheads manage to keep well ahead. So when you see these vehicles, many of them are suffering what used to be called in the armored vehicle game a K-kill, a catastrophic kill. And that's when you see those turrets blow off, that's a K-kill. They're not all K-kills. I mean, that tends to be a subsidiary percentage. And in the early part of the war, the Russians themselves seem to have been sort of unaware of their vulnerabilities. Not that they hadn't done some obvious things to try and fix them, but they seem to have believed that their solutions would work. And there was a lot of bad tactics associated with the Russians early on, and those tactics leaned into the flaws in their vehicles. Can they fix them up a little bit now in real time? Maybe, right? Because you got to remember the Ukrainians were also using Soviet-designed vehicles, and the Eastern Europeans have been shipping to them Soviet-designed vehicles. Now, they've all been tweaked and tinkered with and changed a bit. So it's possible you can kind of, if you spend a few dollars, you can reduce some of these vulnerabilities, but probably not all of them, right? So, we get to pat ourselves on the back for, staying up more than staying up with the threat, really dominating it in this regard. But before we feel too cocky about Western, about the poor state of Russian technology, we should stop and think that the Ukrainians are basically defending themselves with Warsaw Pact pattern surface-to-air missiles from 20 or 30 years ago. And those weapons were just coming into the force when the Cold War kind of dried up. So not very many countries have encountered these weapons, like the S-300 is the one that people like. And I don't know technically exactly how the darn thing works. Owen isn't here. I'm his deputy or his emissary. But the main thing is we always respected Soviet SAMs, right? That was the one thing we did respect. The SA-6, which appeared in the 73 war, was considered to be a pretty deadly system. The Serbs were still pushing them around in the Kosovo war. The Iraqis were still pushing them around, and our people were still treating them seriously. Well, the S-300 seems to be a better system, and the Ukrainians are using it to shoot down Russian airplanes and doing it pretty well. Now, they have a lot of help from us, right? Which, the government's not going to quite tell us how all that help works, but they have a lot of help from us. That's pretty clear, right? But nevertheless, pretty good system. So Russian tanks, still bad. Russian SAMs, still good, right? This is how many years now? So, Austin Long didn't come tonight, but, don't tell him I said, maybe there's a cultural argument here of some kind, but don't share it. You're all sworn to secrecy, right? Second is tactics, right? Now, back in the day, when, in the 80s, when we were still doing the Warsaw Pact NATO business, we did believe that the tactical defense had an advantage. Now, how big was the advantage? Well, nobody was willing to really bet a lot on it, right? But they bet something on it. Modern technology was believed to provide an advantage. And of course, in the West, this has been an argument since at least the late 1890s, and mostly technological developments have given the tactical defense advantages in every generation. Sometimes people have mismanaged exploiting them. But it appears it's actually been quite another big jump in the tactical advantage to the defense. And this has implications for programming, and it has implications for your reinforcement plans, implications for garrison. And the simple story is this, all right? And it's really in direct fire anti-armor weapons, mostly anti-tank guided missiles, and in artillery, right? And the basic thing is the lethality, the range, and in the case of ATGM, the numbers have grown significantly. And what this means is a unit of a given size, if endowed with the appropriate weapons, can probably, at least for a short period of time, defend a piece of front that's much longer than we used to assume back in the day. All right. So in the 80s, when I was doing this, we had a rule of thumb that a standard U.S. armored division, 3 brigades, or a standard German division, 3 brigades, could settle into a chunk of front 25 or 30 kilometers wide and pretty much hold it against all comers, right? Which meant 2 brigades up, 1 back. So you're asking a brigade to dominate 10 or 12 kilometers of front. Sometimes you did a bit more. The Israelis got caught in 73 with much lower densities. So one of their brigades managed to hold 20 odd kilometers on its own. Another was trying to hold 40, got shot to pieces. Right. It appears in this war that brigades are regularly being asked to control 30 kilometers of front or more. Right, which for a Western division would suggest a division holding 60. So back when I was doing this in the old days, 25 kilometers for a division of 15,000 people. Today could be 50, 60, maybe more, right? And this is just on the basis of the range and rate of artillery and the density of ATGM. Just to give you an example, an artillery piece, standard plain vanilla 155 howitzer, you'd find it in the brigade in the old days, maybe 15, 20 kilometers, 25 kilometer ranges. Typically, now we're looking at 30-kilometer range artillery, 40-kilometer range artillery, 50-kilometer range artillery. So a brigade has 18 guns that can drop a concentration of rounds, pretty fancy munitions now, pretty much anywhere along a 40 or 50-kilometer front. This is a kind of a big change, right? Because when you're thinking about force planning or whatever, right, if there's that very long and I believe not very defensible line along the borders of the Baltics with Russia, but this is a positive message, which is maybe it takes fewer forces to defend it than we thought, or at least than I thought, right? So this is, I think, an interesting development, and it is part of a long-term historical story, right? So the final thing is personnel, and I think there were before this war happened, people fixated on their favorite variable, right, and made big predictions on the basis of their favorite variable. My predictions were wrong because my favorite variable was terrain and numbers, right? And you looked at a map, you looked at the terrain, you looked at the numbers. Holy smokes, the Ukrainians are going to get smoked, right? For other people, from the very beginning, it was, oh no, the Ukrainians are, they're going to be heroic fighters fighting for their land. They're nationalistic, and the Russians are just a bunch of lunkheads and mercenaries, don't care, this kind of thing, right? And therefore, everything's going to go bad. So that's the kind of human capital discussion you've typically heard. And there turns out to have some truth to it, although I think it's pretty surprising how well the Russian units have held together given how badly they've been commanded, how badly they've been used, and how much attrition they've taken. So the real question here is really one about attrition, right? And it's not vehicle attrition, right? There's a lot of vehicle attrition on both sides. A lot of things been killed, right? Russians a lot. I think our government claims 6,000 or something vehicles. I don't know if it's true or false, right? But vehicles, you see the burn spots, you see the metal. So good chance, a lot of dead vehicles, right? But it's the vehicles at least to this time, don't fight themselves. We need people, and it's people getting killed, right? And sadly, I think quite unprofessionally, and I think they should be faulted for it. People in the West, I think it started with British intelligence, but then American intelligence. It began kind of doing scorekeeping in the war by estimating casualties and usually talking a lot about the Russian casualties and not very much about the Ukrainian casualties, but hinting that the Ukrainians were suffering serious casualties, pulling up numbers. I never knew where the numbers were coming from. But I got interested in the numbers and I started triangulating on them. One or two of you may have seen a draft of a paper that I had bouncing around for a while. And what I did is I went back and where we have very high resolution data on human casualties, on attrition from the Normandy campaign in World War II, from June when the Americans landed to the end of the war. We have very good high resolution data on the American army and the people, less good data on the Germans. If you think that fighting is roughly comparable, and I actually kind of think it is, right? Big armies that sort of know what they're doing, varied terrain, lots of indirect fire, not all of it accurate, indirect meaning, artillery. One side's on defense most of the time, one side's on offense most of the time. So the Americans are the offenders. So if you use the American experience as a kind of proxy for the Russian experience, and you do some Kentucky windage and sort of say, what's plausible here? And you can also look at the problems Americans had replacing casualties and whatever. I won't drag you through all the arithmetic, and you really have to you can vary a lot of parameters and get numbers that vary from one number to another number. But I think it's quite reasonable to think that each side has, in fact, suffered 40 to 50,000 casualties, right? And it's quite reasonable to believe that within those casualties, at least a quarter are dead, right? And based on American experience, a quarter of dead, a quarter were sufficiently badly wounded that you don't think you're going to get them back into combat within 6 months. Half you think over a period of time, over 6 months on a serial basis, some will be lightly wounded, be returned to duty very quickly, others much later, but over 6 months, right? Our experience is about 80% of the casualties are in the infantry. And it's sort of consistent with common sense. In the end, somebody has to defend the position. In the end, someone has to take the position. It's going to be really bad if you stay inside an infantry fighting vehicle and are hit by an ATGM. That'll happen a few times, and then you'll learn not to do it, and then you'll go back to fighting like plain vanilla infantry. And in the world of plain vanilla infantry, our experience in World War II was 60-70% killed or wounded by artillery, 20% by small arms fire, other stuff. Now, why drag you through this? Well, if you go through and you do a count of how much infantry each side had, and you take 50,000 or so as a number, then maybe you have 40,000 infantry casualties on each side. And if you have 40,000 infantry casualties on each side, you have 100% of the infantry on each side are killed or wounded. Right. Now, I actually don't think that's true, because if it were true, both armies would have melted away already. But it's sort of true in that I think it's quite likely that 50, 60, 70% attrition in the infantry units has occurred. And what we've seen thus far, and this is, to me, a really genuine surprise of the war, is that the Ukrainians, who have 1/3 of the population of the Russians, have been quite good at managing to find individual replacements and put them in units and try and keep their units at some kind of combat strength. They're going to have all kinds of problems absorbing, new people at this rate while being in combat and trying to, keep up your kind of team skills. It's hard to do. And the units will start to get ragged. That's what happened to the American units in the Eastern Fronts, what happened to the German units, who were very good, but even on the Eastern Front, World War II, that happened. And once you begin to see this, if you go back and you look at, the published English language Ukrainian Ministry of Defense white papers of the last few years, you can actually see them hinting at the reserve structure that they created, that I think is what sort of saved them so far in this war. The Russians, on the other hand, if you look hard, this is my calculation, to bring the units up to strength that they committed initially to the fight, they had to essentially send every long service soldier in the Russian army. I'm not saying every officer, but every private soldier who was an infantryman or a tanker or a gunner who had a long service contract with the Russian military, you would consider to be kind of a regular, right? They had to soak them up from every combat unit they had, whether they were sending the units or not. So they soaked essentially the person power of 80 regiments/brigades to bring 40 up to strength and send them into the fight. And when they began to have attrition, they had to basically run around like chickens with their heads cut off trying to find people to replace the losses. And they had different expedients. And up until July, when I drafted this piece, I think maybe Caitlin saw the piece, it looked to me like the Russians were just managing to compete. But now I'm beginning to think, well, maybe this is the long pole in the tent, because if you look at where the successful Ukrainian offensive was, around in Kharkov Oblast, I think most commentators agree that they weren't regular Russian units defending that area. And what the Russians, I think, have had to do is keep contracting their regular units and committing them to the areas they really care about, and then robbing Peter to pay Paul to get some skeletal units to be able to defend. So they used the militias from the republics, the Donetsk and Luhansk republics, and also we're using Russian National Guard people who are basically gendarmerie, right? So, and even Putin in his statements now, when he talks about why he has to mobilize, said, look, it's a long front. We can't cover it unless we have some people. Well, you can't cover it unless you have some people to keep your units up to strength, because if you can't do that, then the units are getting less and less capable. So I'm going to quit now, but basically I'm giving you kind of the benefit of a sort of a 1980s view of a 2020 war, and saying some things have changed, some things maybe not so much. Lesson for the West on this personnel side is, I don't think there's any Western armies that really have much personnel depth. I'm not sure the U.S. Army would be in much better shape if it had to take this kind of attrition. And if you found a land war somewhere you wanted to fight, and I can't find one I want to fight, but I'm sure creative minds will find one, then you're going to have to stop and think, what are you going to do as the attrition starts to to play, to do its deadly work in the combat power of your units? And how are you going to replace them? Where are those people going to come from? Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Barry. It's terrific. Carol, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm sorry not to be there in person, but I want to thank Laura for making it possible for me to participate anyhow. I think I'm going to fill in the edges, sort of the context of what Barry was talking about. The first thing I wanted to talk about was sort of what I think Putin was thinking when he launched the invasion, and then talk about what's happening now. I think the first reason that Putin launched the invasion was NATO expansion. Now, Barry and I disagree on this. I don't subscribe to this all our fault, what I call the it's all our fault school. But I do agree that NATO expansion was one of a number of reasons that Russia launched the war. What I find interesting is that in 2014, which is when the first incursion occurred, the Ukrainians, according to public opinion polling, were not at all interested in NATO expansion. What they were interested in was the association agreement with the EU. We might even argue that Russia's policy backfired because that interest in joining NATO has only exponentially grown in the subsequent years. The Russians were also concerned, I think, about what we call democracy promotion, talking about human rights. I think Putin saw this as an immediate threat to his regime. So if you think about Yanukovych fleeing in 2014 and some of the episodes within Russia itself, this makes some sense to me. I think Russia has, and Putin particularly, has always had a chip on its shoulder. Russia keeps talking about restoring great power status. And this always reminds me of Andrei Gromyko, the long-serving Soviet foreign minister's comments about there shouldn't be any dispute anywhere in the world that Russia or Soviet Union then shouldn't be a part of resolving. I think Russia was afraid of EU encroachment, in part because Putin at the same time was proposing one of his many schemes to keep the post-Soviet states together, the Eurasian Economic Union, and without Ukraine, it was virtually meaningless. And finally, I think that Putin has been imbued with a kind of what I call Russian Orthodox messianism. And it's clear that the Russian Orthodox Church is playing a huge role and is a real cheerleader for the war. There was even speculation in 2014 that the church pushed Putin into the incursion because the Russian Orthodox Church wanted to control the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and that's a whole separate story there. Having said that, we still have to figure out, because those are long-standing reasons, why 2022? So I think the first reason is that, again, going back to NATO, that after Zelensky was elected in 2019, the Constitution was amended to include aspirations for NATO membership. I also think that Putin was trying to time this at a point when he thought that NATO was still weak. Now, if you think about the Trump administration and Trump's sort of lack of understanding, not caring about NATO, and not supporting the NATO alliance, Biden came in determined to restore the transatlantic partnership. And I think that Putin just didn't want to wait too long. We do know that Putin has worked to weaken the Biden administration with the spread of misinformation, anti-vax information, on social media platforms. And Putin must have also been heartened by the disastrous pullout from Afghanistan. And more proximate to the actual outbreak of the war, in the fall of 2021, Zelensky arrested a guy named Medvedchuk, who was a Putin ally, who was the head of all the TV stations in Ukraine that were broadcasting in Russian language and were broadcasting Russian propaganda. In fact, he was just included in one of the more recent prisoner exchanges. And then finally, we have that lovely setting at the Beijing Olympics where Mr. Xi Jinping, and Taylor, you can chime in here, and Putin sort of declared everlasting friendship. Now, if I'd been giving this talk last summer, I probably would have talked about a war of attrition, and the questions would have been how long can either side maintain this, and then what should the West and the United States in particular do? Things have obviously changed with the Ukrainian counteroffensive. It began with a feint towards Kherson, which prompted the Russians to redeploy their troops, and then they attacked around Kharkiv, which shocked the Russians, and the losses led to the mobilization orders. And here, Barry, I do agree with you. Until the mobilization, Russians were careful to send in soldiers from among the ethnic minorities, particularly from Siberia, and not from Moscow or Petersburg, in an effort to quell any dissent in the two capitals. But even now, under the mobilization, where every region has a quota to fill, we know that ethnic minorities are still helping to fulfill those quotas. And we know that people are being picked up off the streets. Their employers are sending them to the military, to the recruiting stations, etc. There are some estimates that over 300,000 men have fled the country. I've seen numbers anywhere from 200,000 to 300,000 initially after the war started, but before the mobilization decree, it was mainly the younger, more educated, the new professionals, IT specialists, etc. Now it's basically everybody who can get to a border where they don't need a visa to cross the border. Going back to the ethnic composition of the troops, I think it's something that we should pay attention to. Even that shooting a couple of weeks ago at a training center was allegedly by ethnic Tajik soldiers firing against ethnic Russians. The mobilization has been such a disaster for Russia that it's actually scheduled to stop. But it's trying to fill in the slot, so to speak, is going to be picked up by the semi-annual draft anyhow. And there's been a lot of speculation in the, I guess, expat Russian press these days that the bureaucracy couldn't handle both the mobilization and the fall draft, which had been postponed for a month. So you're getting to a point where it's not only the number of soldiers, but they can't even figure out whom to send. And the bureaucracy is not geared up for that. There are also reports, and I guess, Barry, you can talk about this too, that untrained troops are being sent to the front, that they're being sent in, if they're equipped at all, with outdated equipment. There was an article the other day about how local soldiers in charge of supply depots have been selling the equipment off and not giving it to the recruits. Just last week, or now 2 weeks ago, I guess, in an effort to further deter Ukrainian advances, Russia annexed the regions where they don't even have full control of the territory. And I'll come back to this in a second. And now, just the other day, they declared martial law, and they apparently are deporting Ukrainians from some of these areas and shipping them literally to Russia, which is a war crime in and of itself. The idea seems to be to hold off further Ukrainian advances until spring. In the meantime, of course, the Kerch Bridge was blown up, and so ostensibly as retaliation, the Kremlin is now pursuing a relentless campaign of missile strikes, the use of the Iranian drones, and the bombing of civilian areas and civilian infrastructure all over the country. If there was a respite in places like Lviv and even Kharkiv and Kiev, that's over. But I think what's really caught everybody's attention is Putin's repeated threat to use a nuclear weapon, and everybody presumes he's meaning a tactical nuclear weapon. And just bottom line, to cut to the chase here, I wouldn't rule it out, but I don't think that Putin would go that far. That's sort of my gut instinct here. I think Putin's hoping that the threat will deter us from further assistance to the Ukrainians and could also provide leverage over Zelensky himself. We and the Europeans have been purposefully vague about how we would retaliate, I think, obviously hoping that the deterrence works in the other direction. I want to say a couple of things about the annexation of the territory, and then sort of sum up by saying what I expect to happen next. There are some who feel that the move to annex the new territory is not just a land grab, but a way to accomplish two other things militarily. First of all, Russian conscripts are not allowed to serve outside of Russian territory proper. But given that Kherson, et cetera, are now, according to Putin anyhow, technically, in quotation marks, Russian territory, they can deploy some of these newer recruits to those areas directly confronting the Ukrainians. I think Putin is also trying to convey that the attacks now with the Ukrainians using Western weapons could be considered an attack on Russia itself. The Russian nuclear doctrine is basically escalate to de-escalate, and first use is allowed if there's an existential threat to the regime itself. The question then is, so would an attack on these territories comprise an existential threat? What happens if the Ukrainians continue to take territory and Russia can't repulse these attacks? I mean, I don't have any answers here. My what next is, I think we'll see sort of more of the same in terms of these terrible attacks on civilian infrastructure, again, with the hope that Zelensky will capitulate. But a public opinion survey just this week indicates that the Ukrainian population is still firmly behind Zelensky and is willing to continue fighting and to continue to fight to liberate Ukrainian territory. And I think even in terms of the West, Putin still has quite a few arrows left in his quiver before we get to any kind of nuclear use. First of all, we have the energy weapon. And I think it's really going to depend in part on what the weather is this winter in Europe, particularly. We've already seen demonstrations in European cities against high energy prices and inflation. And my instinct tells me that the Russians are in some way behind or helping to foment some of these demonstrations because we know that the Russians have mucked around before in the domestic politics of these states. And so the question for us is, will there be defections from this US-NATO alliance if indeed it's a very cold winter? I'm also sure that Putin is hoping that the Democrats lose the midterm elections. And we already have people like Kevin McCarthy and others saying that, Ukraine won't get a blank check anymore, and there's not going to be as much support for Ukraine. And then there was a report just the other day saying that the social media company attached to Mr. Prigozhin, who's also the head of the Wagner forces, this is the Internet Research Agency and other, are flooding the information sphere with disinformation and an attempt to sway the elections. I also think that there are steps that Putin could take short of the use of nuclear weapons. The first is, again, more of the same, more use of the drones, etc. One thing that people have been talking about in the last couple of days is the possible mining or bombing of dams, particularly one near Kherson, which would have a military target, would hurt the Ukrainians, obviously, but it would also flood innumerable towns and villages in the way and cause tremendous destruction. And the Russians have done this before, but this is a particularly large dam and hydroelectric plant. I think Putin might be tempted to use either biological or chemical weapons, not that they're controllable, but that it might be a step short of nuclear weapons. And as an op-ed in the FT in the Financial Times put it the other day, Putin would probably like to avoid using the nuclear weapons, but he is continuing to threaten it, like, don't put me in the corner, I will fight back. So be careful what you're doing, hoping that we will, in effect, self-deter. Another thing to watch for is whether or not Belarus actually joins the fight. The Russians tried to attack Kiev from Belarus at the beginning of the war. There was a lot of sabotage on the trains carrying military equipment. Lukashenko has to think long and hard about whether he wants to do this. He's already in a very precarious position, and I'm not sure he really wants to get dragged into the fight, although there was some reports that some of the missiles used the other day, on Wednesday, in the attack on Ukraine were launched from Belarusian territory. My last comment really has to do about whether there's a way out. I just don't see any moves towards negotiations at the moment. Both sides would have to prepare their populations for compromise, and I don't see either Putin or Zelensky doing that in the short to medium term. Last week, Putin started talking about a ceasefire, but it's reportedly part of a strategy to buy time. And he made it clear that not up for discussion was any compromise over Donbass or Crimea. Ukraine has said that it would only accept a ceasefire. Now, this is even not negotiations, but accept the ceasefire if Russia withdrew from Ukrainian territory and all Russian attacks stopped. So I can't see that happening either anytime soon. So I think the big question is, how do we get there to any point where there would be an acceptable mediator, or there would pressure on both sides to at least cease firing, if not to enter any kind of serious negotiations. some of the literature talks about a hurting stalemate, and Ukraine is certainly hurting, but the Ukrainians are hurting the Russians who are fighting on Ukrainian territory. And aside from some of the attacks on Belgorod, it's not as if the Ukrainians are attacking Russia itself. I'm not sure that Putin would even accept pulling back to the 2014 lines, which is something that a lot of people are talking about. And I'm not sure Zelensky at this point could accept the loss of Crimea and the loss of Donbass, even if Russia were to agree to pull back to the 2014 lines. So I think for the moment, we and the Ukrainians and the Russians are really stuck in what seems to be a long, drawn-out affair. The issue is the money season, then it freezes again. And when it freezes, as we saw the war started in February, the Russians or the Ukrainians could counterattack. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks so much, Carol. Mariya, over to you.
I was asked to speak on the economic aspects of the conflict, so I thought I'd cover two questions: what's being done and why not do more? On the question of what's being done, so far the goal of Western sanctions seems to have been to limit Russian profits from international trade, to decrease its war chest as it applies to Ukraine. When I say Western sanctions, I generally mean US, UK, EU, Australian, sometimes Japanese efforts, Western just for ease of reference. Right now, the focus seems to be on imposing costs on Russia, with the ultimate hope, it seems to be that eventually, given enough costs, Putin will decide that the benefits of the conflict are just not worth it, and that the costs overwhelm any possible benefit he can get from his. The easy sanctions have already been implemented at the start of the conflict. By easy, I mean measures that imposed very little cost on the West, so things like sanctioning Russian individuals, freezing assets, measures that member states can very easily get agreement on, like banning exports of military capabilities to Russia, airplane parts, things that have to do directly with the war effort, measures by individual states, so the US and the UK decision to stop importing Russian oil, or rather the decision to end the phase out the use of oil by the end of this year, so not even an immediate ban. Which for the United States was mostly symbolic because it didn't really import anything from Russia to begin with. For the UK, it was a bit more of an economic distortion, but it's a bit easier for that country to diversify their supplies. But all of the easy sanctions out of the way now, what's really left now are the more complicated collective actions that really impose cost on the West as well as impose cost on Russia at the same time. And here we come to the classic problem of collective sanctions, which is it has distributional effects. And no one state wants to pay more than the other states have to pay for a collective action. So we have situations where Belgium doesn't want to give up its trade with Russia in diamonds, even though Russia gets billions from this trade. France, Hungary, Slovakia, and Finland don't want to give up the access to nuclear fuel, which they get from Russia. So all of these sanctions would impose costs on Russia, but the costs for those sanctions would be borne by one state or a few states, not the whole collective. It's a lot harder to put together a coalition. Even the sort of the headline major European action against Russia right now, the ban on the import of Russian oil, isn't really even a ban on the import of Russian oil. It prohibits the import of Russian oil by sea, which means that oil can't be transported by tankers. States in Europe can still import Russian oil through pipelines, which means that Hungary, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, they still maintain their access to this critical resource. Technically speaking, Germany and Poland still also import Russian oil by pipeline. Now, they've committed to voluntarily stop importing Russian oil, but we've yet to see how that plays out. And as Carol says, it depends on how things go over the winter. But in general, carving out these kinds of concessions to different individual states weakens the bite of sanctions. But unfortunately, without the concessions, there will be no sanctions at all. The other way that Europe waters down their sanctions regime is sort of in order to defer the cost of the sanctions to individual member states is by stretching out the timeline of the sanctions. So the ban to import seaborne oil from Russia isn't even in effect yet. It'll be in effect starting the start of December. The decision for the ban was made at the start of June. Now that gives a lot of time, which Europe needs in order to diversify its own supply. So it'll be able to get products from elsewhere. Unfortunately, this also gives Russia the exact same amount of time to find alternative buyers to sell their oil to. And India and China are in fact buying. So diversification is happening, actual imposed costs, questionable. But there's actually a more interesting side effect to the long lead time from this ban. Knowing that the imports will be prohibited starting in December gives European firms an incentive to import more now from Russia while this avenue for trade is still open. So while those firms look for different sources of supply, while they're negotiating new delivery schedules, looking for ways to diversify, they also want to make sure that they don't end up with shortages. And the best short-term solution to make sure that you don't end up with shortages is to buy as much Russian oil as you can right now. So if the goal is to decrease Russian profits, this policy seems to be doing the exact opposite of what it intends to do. And if we look at the statistics from the announcement of the ban, Russian exports dropped by 4%. The International Energy Agency tells us that Russian oil revenues actually doubled in the first half of the year. So you can judge how impactful the policy is on your own. And since we're talking oil policy and oil prices, the other major European Western proposal right now, the price cap on Russian oil, seems to be the genius idea that will keep us, to give us a chance to punish Russia. The basic idea behind the price cap is that Russia is a major supplier of oil, produces 11% of the global oil supply at the moment. So losing access to all of that oil will be very painful for the world, especially now that OPEC decided not to limit their production. There's different ways of reading that, but at the very least, we can say that OPEC decided that it will not make up for the shortfall in case the world loses access to Russian oil. So the West has to play a very careful line between making sure that Russia does not stop exporting completely, but at the same time, to prevent Russia from making a profit from this trade and to add to its war chest in Ukraine, it needs to find a way to limit the price of oil. So their solution is a price cap which makes sure that the Russian price of Russian oil can be sold at a certain, yet to be determined maximum price. From the current discussions, it seems that this price will be set at a slightly higher level than the cost of Russian production. The idea being is economically, if it's still worthwhile for Russia to produce and export the oil, it will continue to do this. And since the price of oil will be about the price of production, it won't be able to profit from the extraction of this oil. And all of this will be enforced through European insurance underwriters, mostly. The idea being is that they would no longer be able to insure the transfer of Russian oil unless the oil was being sold at this capped level. The theory of this, the economic theory behind this, is very elegant. In practice, there seem to be a lot of misunderstandings of the two sides between each other. So Russia has already said many times through many different channels that it will refuse to export oil to any country that adheres to this price cap. So in essence, the West is treating this as a question of economics. Whether or not Russia is willing to export oil, if it's still worthwhile to them, it's a question of absolute gains. If we make it just worth it enough, Russia will continue funneling this oil. Russia's treating this as a question of politics. It's claiming that it's willing to suffer the costs regardless of anything the United States and the West does about it. So it's willing to absorb the costs to avoid American demands, the Western demands. So very much a misunderstanding of how each side reads this treatment. At the same time, Russia can continue to export its oil through less legal means. It has the example of Venezuela and Iran to follow, who have spent a considerable amount of time under Western sanctions trying to perfect a system of avoiding ways to be sanctioned. But there's also a perfectly legal avenue available to Russian firms. It's only European firms at present that insure Russian oil transfers, so asking them to impose this price cap seems to make sense. But the alternative here is that European firms basically invite someone else to step in and compete with them for that insurance. So other states can start providing the same kinds of insurance, and they won't have to observe the cap, and the enforcement mechanism sort of falls apart. And we can see that Chinese vessels are already carrying Russian oil. India is already issuing safety certificates for Russian tankers, and Russian companies have already started to provide insurance for the entire transaction. And of course, this entire discussion so far sort of assumes that the enforcement mechanism, if it is used, can work, but the insurance companies in Europe themselves are pointing out that they don't have the capability for determining what the trading price of oil that they insure actually is. And given the current enforcement mechanism, basically their greatest enforcement capability would be for Western customers, the same Western customers that are not supposed to import Russian oil as it is. So it's a question of, we're not entirely sure who is going to be able to impose this or how it's going to work or whether it'll in fact actually impose any costs. That's what's being done now. So then the question of why not do more? And if we think about this sort of from a pure capability sort of point of view, technically speaking, the West can do a lot more. They can, in fact, strangle the Russian economy. They have the capability for completely isolating the country, forcing it to autarkic levels of existence, severing all trade with the country. They can use secondary sanctions, which target third parties, not just the initial target of the sanctions, in order to force other countries to follow the economic line. And combined, the United States and the EU market is in fact large enough that the threat of being denied access to these markets would make virtually any state seriously question whether they want to cooperate with the West or with Russia. And if it sort of push came to shove, the West can make sure that the arrow points to cooperate with them. So if the possibility of pushing things to this extreme exists, why not use it? Why not try to do this? The easy answer to this question is the economic costs of the policy. So stringent enforcement requires giving up a lot of your own trade. In addition to the direct costs, there's the relative gains compared to other countries. We have classic examples coming up with the European bans now. So Greek tankers deliver a lot of oil from Russia to India and to China. Under the current proposals, they're supposed to stop doing this. But of course, their claim is, if we stop doing this, someone else will simply pick up that trade for us. Our industry dies, we lose, someone else gains. The relative gains of this doesn't appeal to us. And at the same time, Russia is no worse off. So the indirect costs add to the direct costs of severing trade. There's also considerable political costs to doing this. So if the West really wants to isolate the Russian economy, this requires a lot of strong arming of currently neutral states into following Western sanctions. And we're not talking about polite chats, emotional appeals, or strongly worded messages. This would actually have to be forceful action, because the idea is to impose on these neutral countries an economic loss of their own trade with Russia. And in order to be able to do that, you have to use secondary sanctions. So the pain of severing trade with Russia would need to pale in comparison to losing trade with the West. Currently, about half of the G20 does not even subscribe to the level of sanctions in existence now. The kinds of sanctions we're talking about for economic strangulation of Russia would have to be a lot more extreme. So in order to force a lot of countries to subscribe to these sanctions would require a lot of strong arming. High political costs. But that's only the easy answer. The second answer, the more terrifying answer, is economic strangulation of Russia is actually incredibly escalatory. And this seems to be missed by a lot of analytical analyses that I read, which is terrifying me to death. The idea is economic tools are perceived as being less escalatory because they don't involve kinetic damage. Technically speaking, true, but ignores the fact that the economy of the state and the military of the state are sort of intrinsically connected. This is the basis of how sanctions are meant to work. The reason the West wants to decrease the Russian war chest is because they understand that that money is used for military strength. So if we carry over this logic to economic strangulation, preventing Russia from importing anything that it needs for its military from abroad will affect its military strength. And the crux of the issue is, it won't only affect the Russian military strength as it relates to the conflict in Ukraine, it will affect Russian military strength full stop, which means that eventually it will not be able to do things like self-defense. Now, from a Western perspective, this might not seem like much of a problem because the Western perspective tends to assume that states follow the rules of international order, and if all states follow the rules of international order, no one really needs to fear much of anything. From the Russian perspective, Understanding that states do not always follow the rules of international order, not being able to defend your own territory seems incredibly threatening. We might even say existentially threatening. So the economic strangulation can actually place a state in a very similar kind of situation as a military attack on the homeland. And as Carol pointed out, doing this with a nuclear-armed state seems like a very dangerous proposition.
Great. Thanks, Mariya. So we've got some time for questions, and I'll stand up so I have a good view of the room. I believe we have, is it one microphone for folks to use over here? Is that correct? Yep. Okay. So we have a microphone on this side of the room. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and then make your way over to the microphone. Andrew.
Thank you all. Two questions, actually. One is for Barry, which is about this comment about the length of a front that a unit can hold. I wonder if what we're seeing in Ukraine is about the necessity versus the ability of those units and how that would apply in a place like the Baltic states, especially given a different set of capabilities. Part of my question is about how we would know and how we did know. I think there's various tools that you could use. You could look at history, you could look at combat simulation, you could use different tools to help to figure that out, and how we would take what we've seen in Ukraine and input that into the future is useful. Complicating factor is that units could use different tactics to defend territory with different expectations. For example, we saw quite different behavior at the beginning of the Ukraine war when Russia was doing different things than we see now, et cetera. So curious more on that. For Mariya, your story on oil, I think, is convincing, but I think my question is about gas. A significant part of the Russian budget came from exporting gas to Europe with infrastructure that, as you know, is hard to divert for other purposes. Russia's building pipelines to China. They go to different oil fields, et cetera. So Russia has accepted a significant, presumably, impact to its budget by ceasing to export gas. Somebody blew up a pipeline, so it strikes me that there is a pretty significant impact already on Russia's budget, and I'm curious how you see gas playing a role in that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. Barry, you want to take a stab?
Well, I think we're going to figure this out in the usual ways. When the war ends, we will ask around. It's unfortunate that, or maybe it's not, maybe this is false, but during World War II, we got into the habit of deploying military operations research teams in real time, not quite real time, but pretty soon after the fights. And we collected a lot of data. Not all the data was good. Some people claim to collect data that there didn't exist, like this business about infantry firing and all that stuff. But there'll be some data from the war, right? And I'm sure we're collecting some now. Second, you got to kind of work the hypothesis into some models and into some simulations and into some national training center rotations and see how it goes. And you can pit various reds against various blues and various circumstances. Third, you can try and go back and reconstruct how we used to come to these conclusions before, right? As why was it doctored in World War II that an infantry division could hold 16 kilometers? Why was it doctored in hold 25 kilometers? The truth of the matter is, I think that you can reconstruct it by just looking at the ranges of weapons and rates of fire, right? I've done it. I just for fun, right? Because the militaries, they build these things up in a bunch of different ways. So, we have to triangulate on it. As I said, this is a working hypothesis. I think the general trend is right. I think it's part of a general trend. I think some of the reasons that affect the trend are right. There are many more that I did not discuss here, right? I think our abilities to surveil the battlefield and to do targeting have improved immensely so that you can take advantage of the range of these weapons. I think it's actually quite hard now to do a surprise concentration of combat power. I actually do not believe that Ukraine surprised the Russians in Kharkov. I think the Russians just didn't have any choice. They just didn't have enough Schlitz to have the third party, and that was just the way it worked out. I think you see patterns that are interesting, and I think you're right about comparing the northern part of the country to the southern. Sort of too soon to tell, and all you really have kind of are anecdotes, but the champion weapon of the anti-armor weapon of the fighting in the north was probably the British weapon, and that weapon is optimized for a 600 or 700 meter shot, which is probably about as much range as you got in the terrain, because it was a mix of urban and forest and stuff like exurban, right? In the south, you just look at Google Earth and you can see this is the miles and miles of wheat joke, right? I mean, there's a lot of long shots that are possible. And remember, I think the thing here is not just the range and the accuracy of the systems, but the density. I think the densities are going up. There's just lots of shooters out there. So I would expect to find, if we could see a pattern, that there's something going on that you wouldn't necessarily expect, which is the attackers have learned that when formerly you might have looked for an open bit of hard ground to be able to mass armor for an assault, and then you take your chances with the attrition on the theory that if you lost half, you would overwhelm the defender still with what was left because you had concentrated so much combat power. I have a suspicion that they're not even trying that anymore on either side. And I think they're probably not trying it because the killing zones are just too lethal. So my guess is we're going to find that attackers are attacking in places we would normally say are advantageous to the defense. They're attacking in exurban and wooded areas because it's the only place there's enough cover. And then they're just duking it out with artillery and then small unit engagements until they can bite their way through, right? So all of the fighting, I think the fighting is starting to look more like that. And I have a suspicion that technology plus reconnaissance, right, which makes surprise hard. I think that's my hypothesis for what's happening. And I think we can, we can research that hypothesis, and I'm guessing, we will be. As I said, it's a working hypothesis. We're reading the tea leaves here and not drawing, firm conclusions. I'm sorry, it's a long-winded answer. By the way, I want to talk about this Russian mobilization at some point, but I want to give the floor to Mariya. We'll come back to the Russian mobilization because I'm more scared of it than most people are.
Mariya?
No, please.
Okay. Well, don't have too much to add. All of the sanctions are having an impact on Russia. Even the oil sanctions are having an impact on Russia. So, of course, the gas sanctions, everything is having an impact. The question, in my mind, the interesting question is not so much are they having an impact, but are they having enough of an impact to produce the foreign policy outcome that the United States wants? And given that with what's going on with gas is that it's mostly thus far, if you buy the narrative, Russia turning off a lot of the gas supplies, lowering a lot of the gas supplies, then plausibly is just a signal from Russia saying that this is going to hurt you a lot more than it's going to hurt us.
Can I follow up? That would have been unimaginable, I think, prior to February.
Actually, there won't be any audio in the video.
Sorry. So the Russia's decision basically to cut, X percent of energy exports voluntarily would have been unimaginable. So yes, one would think that it would have been a rational decision for Russia given what happened, but the impact on Russia's, do you have a guess of what that would be? It seems that the same logic that you said of the impact on Russia's defensive capability applies as much from, long-term efforts to sell billions of cubic meters of gas to Europe. So how does the gas story compare in magnitude to the oil story?
In terms of the actual numbers, I don't have them at the top of my head, so I don't know. But for me, the question here is is the Russia willing to put up with the costs? And if we buy the narrative that Russia is the one that's sabotaging the pipelines, that it's the one that's lowering the cost, the access of gas delivered to Europe, then the answer seems to be that yes, it is willing to do it.
Great, thanks. Sarah?
Thanks, everybody. And I also have two questions.
In the finest of
They're
SSP
really-
traditions, everyone's got more than one question.
They're, of course, related. They're both about deterrence. So I was wondering how much we can learn from this conflict about intra-war deterrence and escalation management, both deterring forms of vertical and horizontal escalation. And the second question is, what can we learn about from the conflict about how to manage simultaneous multi-targeted deterrence, especially given the crisis that followed in the Kodel visit to Taiwan? Thanks.
Who would like to take a first cut at that?
I can only. Well, I think intra-war deterrence. You have to ask who's deterring whom, or who's trying to deter whom, right? The Ukrainians and the Russians are trying to deter each other. We try to deter the Russians. The Russians are trying to deter us. Nuclear weapons have been in the mix, and nuclear threats have been in the mix from the beginning. President Biden said early on that there's a reason we weren't going to have a new fly zone, was because he didn't want to have a direct clash with the Russians because he thought there was a risk of nuclear escalation. I think it was a perfectly wise decision. So I think, without being able to say anything particularly definitive, I keep thinking about Schelling's discussion in Arms and Influence about limited war, and that in limited war, you don't start with a rule book, you kind of write it through a dialogue of words and deployments and attacks and non-attacks. So it's pretty clear that the Americans, mindful of the nuclear risk and mindful of the direct clash, have decided that range plus lethality is a thing they're willing to constrain in order to be allowed to do the other things they want to do, right? Which is help the Ukrainians almost as much as they can, but not entirely. I think, oddly enough, I suspect the same is true of the Germans. I think the Germans are vetoing Leopard 2s because they want to leave some bridge back to the Russians, and also because, this is a macabre Barry joke, but the last time we had Panzers in Ukraine, things didn't work out so well, right? I think there's not a lot, but some really significant bargaining going on that's been effective. But I also think that there's fairly deliberate efforts by at least one side to destroy some of those saliencies and to generate escalation. And I think we know which side that is, right? I think these Ukrainian attacks on the Russian side of the border, they can't do much actual military good. Even the bridge attack, I suspect, is not going to do that much military good. But if Zelensky and his generals didn't know the risks that they were running, then they had to be pretty foolish, right? It's been common knowledge for weeks, if not months, that the Ukrainian energy infrastructure is incredibly vulnerable. And there's a wonderful article by a guy named Thomas Popik or something like that in a journal that's in the Resilience. It's got a name like the Journal of Resilience and something. It's a 15 or 16 page disquisition on the vulnerabilities of the Ukrainian energy system. Right? It's been out for over a month, all done on the basis of open sources. Brilliant. It reads like a strategic targeting document. It's a brilliant piece of work, right? So somehow the fact that the Russians had, for whatever reason, left these targets largely alone, even though they could have hit them really any time in the last several months, that's the salience. And if you know anything about the energy infrastructure, you knew how vulnerable they were. And you said, well, the dog that's not barking is the Russians aren't attacking their energy infrastructure. As some wag pointed out somewhere today, the Americans didn't wait very long in the 1991 war with Iraq to blow away Iraq's energy infrastructure, right? So there was, and I'm not saying that Putin did this out of the goodness of his heart. I think people hold things in reserve in the hopes that it will deter moves, or so that they have something in the quiver to be able to respond if certain things happen, right? So as I see it, Russia and Ukraine are on an ever, I want to say even more slippery slope. I like Khrushchev's language back in the Cuban Missile Crisis about pulling on the rope and tying tighter the knot of war, right? I think that's what's happening. They're not just being tied, right? So I think there has been intra-war deterrence. I think there's still intra-war deterrence. But I also think that not everyone wants that to work, right? This is a conflict, right? And this is why all limited wars aren't limited in every respect. I mean, we observed certain saliencies in the Korean War, but it didn't stop us from bombing the snot out of every North Korean town we could find and killing tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people in the process, right? But we kind of knew it was not a good idea to run aircraft sorties across the Yalu River, right? Now, there were warnings we got not to go to the Yalu, which we chose to ignore. So you can see that limited war is not magic. It's a thing, right? And it's the flip side of escalation, right? And those things are in tandem, and it has to be a question of interest, right? Each side's interest, as well as its skills, its commitment to the bargain. It's a really strange thing. There's not a lot of recent theorizing on limited war. You got to go back and read Morton Halpern's original book. People stopped writing and thinking about it, right? But I hope it has a comeback. I hope from an intellectual point of view it has a comeback. Sorry, I was a long-winded answer.
Carol, anything you'd like to add?
I think that that Barry's right. I think that the Russians seem to have been deliberate in what they have struck throughout the war. I think the deterrence question is an interesting one, because if you go back to the beginning, like last December and January, was there a deterrent effect to the intelligence that we were releasing publicly and telling the Ukrainians, you know, they're going to hit this and they're going to hit that and the war is going to start? And Zelensky, there was a report the other day, Zelensky didn't want to alarm the population and kind of didn't really believe it, even though we were providing him with all the intelligence. So I think that if we're going to discuss deterrence, we should look at that period just prior to the war, as well as what's happening now.
Thanks. This gentleman in the front had a question. Please go to the microphone. Thank you.
Could anyone comment on the Russian public's support for the war as it's stretched on? Has that changed, particularly as more Russian soldiers have been mobilized, and also just their perception of the justification of the war? And any comments on that?
Carol,
I'm happy to start.
Yeah.
Mariya, you may want to jump in as well. Early on, the conventional wisdom, and I can't prove any of this, was that people were in favor of the war. Russian TV was broadcasting, you know, that this was a limited military operation, that the Ukrainians were out to get the Russians, that they were denazifying Ukraine, and that harked back to World War II and Ukrainian collaboration with the Nazis, and that's the Great Patriotic War. And so it really fit into this narrative that the Russians, the Soviets, and now the Russians have always had. You know, if you're operating in an authoritarian state and someone calls you up on the phone and says, well, do you support Mr. Putin? You're not likely to say no. So we really don't have any great statistics, and the public opinion of polling, I just don't think is terribly reliable. There were all those demonstrations at the beginning, and many thousands of people were arrested. Now the threat is, if you're arrested, if you dared to protest, you would get thrown into the military. The mobilization seems to have fractured some of that support. From what we can tell, the families where, the men have been picked up off the street and everything are very concerned and are much quieter. I don't think you're going to see loud protests. I don't think that you're going to see a situation in which there are massive demonstrations demanding Mr. Putin's head. But the signs are that there's this kind of quiet resignation, if not opposition to the war. And of course, going to what Mariya's been talking about, as certain goods have disappeared, people are beginning to suspect that this isn't such a great operation anymore, and that it's really just not a minor war the way Putin tried to sell it initially. The last point that I would make is that again, is that we don't really know what the opposition is. I would be more attuned to some of the elite opposition in terms of speculating on Putin's future than on mass opposition. There's no history of the people taking to the streets and overthrowing, whether it's a czar or a Soviet leader or a Russian leader. So I think that any speculation in that regard is just off the mark.
Great, thanks. Mariya, Barry, anything you want to add on this question? No, great. The back?
So my question for all three of you, and first of all, thank you for this. This was a really fascinating event. Should we fear a growing perception of Russian military weakness? So this was kind of a recurring theme last week at the AUSA conference, the Army's conference here in DC. And there was arguments that we're seeing weakness at the tactical, operational, and strategic level. And how will that influence defense spending, NATO percentage spent on their defense spending, on our own military tactics and plans, just kind of holistically across the board? What do we have to fear from that perception? And is it grounded in reality or truth?
Well, I mean, I would say it's too soon to tell. I'm sort of a crazy person in these debates, and I've been arguing for a while that, as far as the division of labor in NATO is concerned, that ground and air should be handled by Europeans, not by Americans, and that the Europeans don't have far to go to be able to do that. They bought the force structure, they bought the weapons, they designed them. They just haven't bought everything you need to glue it together and keep it running for longer than a few weeks. And as I mentioned earlier, they don't really have, most of them don't have reserves, even volunteer reserves. But in principle, even before this happened, I argued in survival 2 years ago or 18 months ago that for the basic case, which for me is the Polish border, not the Baltic borders, which I consider to be a crazy commitment that was almost impossible to meet under any circumstances, right? So I'm not willing to be drawn into that comparison because it's tactically crazy, right? But I think before one is willing to sort of then even go beyond my sort of threat deflated view of what the Russian military was before this war, before you want to drop down one level and say, look, these people are done, you kind of want to look at the whole package and get yourself some sort of a sense of why things have gone wrong for them, right? And, they screw up most of their wars in the early months, often really badly. They don't care much about casualties historically. Even World War II, it's, the casualty exchange ratio with the Wehrmacht is just bizarre. I mean, it's so awful, right? And it was why I said earlier about, hey, some Russian weapons, they look as bad as they always did. And some kind of look pretty good. So it makes you think, S-400, do you really want to have contempt for it? Are you really ready for that, right? I think we want to see how they perform in the next 12 months. We want to see what they can do with a defense industry that's shorn of easy access to Western technology. They'll have access. They'll just have to pay top dollar for it, and they'll get it in dribbles and drabbles, and they'll have to make do with a microchips, opening up 1,000 cell phones and stealing the microchips or something. But I think in their inimitable fashion, they will find a way. But this cuts to my question about mobilization. We now have this habit in the Western press of collecting embarrassing Russian mobilization stories, and they're all good for a giggle, and they're all good for morale, right? And they do make the Russians look like lunkheads, right? But they often, historically, when they do things militarily, they look like lunkheads. But to me, what they're doing, everything they're doing makes a kind of sense, right? That's the part that I think people should stop and think, right? By my count, the Russians had about an 80-regiment army, if you count Marine regiment, brigades, and airborne and all that stuff. Just as military balance stuff. If we re-aggregate those into old-fashioned Russian divisions, that's 20. I think they sent half of them into this fight. So I think they sent 40 regiments into this fight and got them shot up. I think they stripped 30 or 40 regiments of their long service troops for the fight. If you do the numbers, they need about 200,000 troops to repopulate those 40 regiments that were stripped. And this is what the mobilization looks like. It's 200,000 or 300,000 troops. So it looks right. And they're sending the current 12-month conscripts home, which to me is really weird. If you're desperate for replacements, these are the best trained people in reserve. They're still not sending them, despite having changed the law in the Donbass. They're sending them home. They're delaying the arrival of the next conscript class. So what does that tell you? Each conscript class has been around 100,000 in the demi class, 200,000 a year. So they're opening 200,000 training spaces for 200,000 mobilized reservists that they're going to try and train up in the next 6 or 8 weeks to populate the 40 regiments that have been denuded. So to me, it all looks right based upon what we used to believe about these people and what the force structure looks like, right? For anybody who really wants to amuse themselves and get into the weeds, go to the CIA website and dig up a publication from the bad old days called the Interagency Intelligence Memoranda on the Readiness of Soviet Ground Forces, right? And it's declassified now. They just came out when I was in the building as a whippersnapper in the early 80s, right? And it talks about how they do things, how they mobilize. And my whole premise here is that, this is your father's Oldsmobile, and nobody will get that joke, right? But they don't change very much, right? And so the mobilization is looking to me like their old mobilization looked. And we used to give them too much credit for being able to do this quickly. But if they have, a couple months to pull these units together or longer, and they bring him into the back of the fight in some organized way, the Ukrainians are going to have a brawl. And I think the Ukrainians know they're getting ready to have another brawl. And I think we know. And I don't think anybody exactly knows how it's going to go. I don't think the Russians are going to be in a position to win some new decisive victory. But I think we could have just another real hideous clash at some point, not a year from now, but maybe not in the fall freeze, but certainly after the spring rainy season dries up next spring, these two parties may go at each other hammer and tongs again in many sectors of the front, and we'll see if the Russians have learned anything.
Okay, time for one more question right here in front. Thanks.
Hi. I just want to ask a quick follow-up. Sorry, I do have 2 questions. I will subscribe to the tradition.
Don't ask both of them for In fact, don't even ask one of them.
Well, it's a specific follow up to something you mentioned. Just it's a quick follow up to as Putin is now hitting, or the Russians are now hitting the energy infrastructure in Ukraine. Is that maybe a sign that he's accepting that he's not going to be taking and holding this territory, that he's shifting from trying to seize towns with working infrastructure to accepting that it's, he's not going to get them and it's switching to terror bombing?
Well, people can say, infer whatever they want from the patterns of things.
Can I jump in for a sec, Barry?
Yeah,
I can't hear you if you're saying
okay, so
something.
you can infer whatever you want from the patterns of things, but my simple mind says that they want to hold the 4 places they annexed, and that any pretensions to conquer the rest of the country, or to knock over the regime or get any of what seemed to be their initial war goals, I think maybe that's out the window. They're in the real estate business now, and they're trying to annex 4 big chunks of territory, and they're waging war any way they know how. So they're trying to hurt the Ukrainians. It's hurt. The Ukrainians also have a war industry, and they're trying to damage it. They're trying to impose costs on the West, who are going to have to subsidize all the energy in Ukraine now. While we're having energy problems in the West, we're going to have energy problems in Ukraine that we're going to be on the hook to look after, which is imposing more costs, creating more aggravation. And then, if the Russians dig in and have a new force in the spring and the Ukrainians go after them again, the Russians just try and keep blooding their noses and say, when are you going to accept that these 4 oblasts are now Russian? Right? That's what I think is happening.
Carol, do you want to get in here?
Yeah, I think there's another point here as well. The Russians are notorious in terms, or Putin is, in terms of thinking tactically and not strategically. So I'm not sure that Putin is thinking beyond, I'm going to do something now so that I can make the Ukrainians hurt even more than they're currently hurting. The other thing that's starting to get talked about in some of the stuff that I read is that just as they did in Syria in 2015, they are trying to create yet another wave of refugees that would further hurt Europe. It's now winter. We're talking about energy shortages in Europe, et cetera. And so therefore they are going after the infrastructure. I don't think anybody is thinking about what happens if and when there's ever a ceasefire or, God willing, peace at some point. Who is going to rebuild, whether it's Donbass or Kherson or Ukraine in general, with all this destruction? Is it going to be the West? If Russia controls it, Russia can't afford to rebuild it. I think it's very short-sighted thinking, but it's going to accomplish what they need to accomplish today and tomorrow.
And then my my actual initial question was, there's been a lot of I don't want to say blame, but responsibility for Putin pursuing this path based on NATO expansion in the past 20 years or so. How much of that would actually be attributed to the EU's expansion, with economic and political power shifting away from these small states that were in the Soviet periphery and the Russian periphery over to Brussels, and then giving the Russians less economic and political room to maneuver and keep those countries kind of within their sphere of influence, or unstable enough where they are the main actor?
Carol, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I can take that. I think, as I tried to argue in my talk, that for Putin, the Ukrainian drift westward, the Ukrainian drift towards the European Union was what was a major slap in the face. At the point when Putin, quote, ran for re-election in 2012, his whole thing was this Eurasian Economic Union, which was supposed to be a counter to the EU, but without Ukraine, it is meaningless. So that's number one. I think number two, again, in terms of Ukraine, one of the things that Putin feared was that Ukraine, if it imported, Western manufactured goods, that a lot of those goods would then make it into Russia. And as we know, European consumer goods are much better than Russian consumer goods. I think it's less of an issue for the other smaller post-Soviet states. But going back to what I said at the beginning as well, I think one of the things that Putin resents is this whole idea that there are trading rules, that there's some kind of rule of law within the EU or states that are affiliated with the EU that doesn't help Putin steal anymore. I'm sorry, I'm being a little bit sarcastic here. Putin steal anymore from the Russian state, etc. So that if he loses, I think you're right, if he loses the room for maneuver because these states start to become more law-abiding, if you will, then Putin loses some of the leverage. I mean, I would have argued, for example, that Ukrainian corruption and Ukrainian dysfunction prior to the war was basically what allowed it to be manipulated by Putin for the last, I don't know how many years. So I think that there is something to be feared, and it's both abstract and very specific once we get to Ukraine.
Great. Thanks, Carol. So this will bring us to a close, but I wanted to ask our panelists if they had any final thoughts they'd like to share.
I've spoken too much already.
No, Carol, any final thoughts?
I think I raised a lot of questions in my talk, and I think that we just have to sort of watch and wait and see how certain pieces of this play out. And again, as Mariya and I have both argued, some of the questions are going to be decided by the weather gods or whatever this winter, in addition to how militarily proficient either Ukraine or Russia actually is.
Wonderful. Well, thanks to all of you for coming out this afternoon, and please joining me in thanking this wonderful panel from MIT.
This talk was terrific.